she was already late, and the truck wasn't starting. Celia Drummond sat behind the wheel of her father's old Ford and listened to it click and die, the same sorry rhythm it had been making since February. Outside, the Alberta sky was the color of old pewter, low and pressing, the kind of sky that didn't threaten snow so much as promise it. She was 26 years old. She had $43 in her checking account, and in 6 hours she was supposed to marry a man she had never met. She didn't think about that last part too long. Her father appeared at the driver's side window, his breath fogging the glass. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Walter Drummond had the particular talent of communicating disappointment without moving his face much, and he was using it now. Celia got out of the truck and followed him back inside. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and old newspaper. Her mother, Adele, was at the stove even though there was nothing on it, just standing there with her arms crossed the way she stood when she had a lot to say and was holding most of it back. "The Thibodeau boy called again," Adele said. "He's not a boy. He's not a husband either. Not yet." Celia poured herself what was left in the pot. It was bad, genuinely bad, the kind of coffee that had been sitting since 5 in the morning, but she drank it anyway because it gave her something to do with her hands. Her father's farm, her father's debt, more accurately, had been the starting point of the whole arrangement. 3 years of bad harvests, a broken combine, a loan that had been restructured twice, and then the news last October that the Pemberton Credit Union wasn't in the business of restructuring a third time. Walter Drummond was 61 and not well, and the farm that his own father had broken ground on in 1952 was going to be sold for parts by spring unless something changed. Something changing, in this case, meant Renaud Thibodeau. He owned the land to the north and east of them, about 800 acres total, good land, the kind that didn't flood and didn't freeze shallow. He was 34. He had been running the Thibodeau operation alone since his own father passed 4 years ago. He had the money to clear Walter's debt without feeling it, and he had made the offer in a way that was so straightforward it had taken Celia several days to understand it wasn't a joke. He needed a wife. She needed a solution. If she was willing, the debt would be paid. She had asked her father why Renaud Thibodeau, with 800 acres and no debt, could not simply find a woman who wanted to marry him. Walter had looked at the table for a long moment. "He's not easy," he said finally. "Never has been." That was not the most reassuring thing she had ever heard. The drive to the Thibodeau property took 20 minutes on roads that were half gravel and half frozen mud, the landscape on either side of them flat and gray and enormous. Adele drove. She had offered to come along for the civil ceremony at the county office in Dunmore, and Celia had said yes because the alternative was doing it alone. And she was not quite brave enough for that. They didn't talk much. The radio was on, something country and twanging, and Celia watched the fence posts go by and thought about the things she wasn't going to think about. Her apartment in Lethbridge, which she had given up 3 weeks ago. The job at the agricultural supply company she had worked for 2 years and liked reasonably well. The idea she had carried quietly for most of her adult life that she would marry someone she loved, or at least someone she had met more than twice. She had met Renaud Thibodeau twice. The first time was in November, at her parents' kitchen table, when he had driven over to lay out the terms in person. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of weathered complexion that came from years of being outside in every possible kind of weather. He had shaken her hand when he came in and again when he left, and in between he had spoken clearly and without any particular warmth about what he was proposing and what he was offering. He had looked at her directly the whole time. He never smiled. The second time was 3 weeks later, when she had driven out with her father to sign some preliminary paperwork. Renaud had met them at the door, brought them into the kitchen, offered coffee. He had spoken to her father mostly. Once, when she asked a question about which parts of the house she would have access to. She still wasn't entirely sure why she had asked it that way, as though she were negotiating a lease. He had looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read and said, "All of it. It'll be your house, too." That was the most he had said to her directly. And now it was March, and she was sitting in the back of her mother's Subaru on the way to Dunmore to make it legal. The civil ceremony was short. A justice of the peace named Gwen, who had a kind face and a practical manner, read the words. And Celia said the words back, and Rhoda stood beside her and said them too, in a voice that was quiet and even. He was wearing a clean shirt, dark blue, and he had shaved recently. He smelled like cedar and cold air. When Gwen said he could kiss his bride, he leaned over and pressed his lips to Celia's cheek, so briefly and so gently that she almost didn't feel it. Adele cried a little on the way out, which Celia had not expected. She hugged her mother in the parking lot and felt something shift loose in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine. Renaud had driven himself. He waited by his truck while Celia said goodbye, and when she came over, he opened the passenger door without being asked. She got in. He walked around and started the engine. They pulled out of the parking lot and onto the highway, and neither of them spoke for a while. "Hungry," he said finally. "A little. I can stop in town, or there's food at the house." He paused. "Your call. The house is fine." He nodded and kept driving. The Thibodeau farmhouse was older than her parents' place and better maintained. Whoever had been doing the upkeep, she suspected Renaud himself, from the precise way the porch boards were replaced and the caulking around the windows, had done it carefully. Inside it was clean and spare, not much decoration, but the floors were good hardwood, and the kitchen was large with a window over the sink that looked out over the back fields. He showed her the room that would be hers. It was at the end of the hall, separated from the master bedroom by the bathroom and a linen closet. There was a bed with a quilt that looked handmade, a dresser, a window facing east. Her boxes were already there. He had arranged to have them brought over earlier that week. "If you need anything different," he said from the doorway, "just say." She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the quilt. It was blue and cream, geometric, very carefully made. "Did someone in your family make this?" A pause. "My mother." She looked at him then. His expression hadn't changed, but there was something slightly careful about the stillness of it. "It's beautiful," she said. He said nothing. He went back down the hall. Dinner was soup he had made from a stock that had been on the back burner most of the day, and bread from the bakery in town. He put it on the table, and they ate across from each other in a silence that was not quite comfortable but was not hostile either. Celia found herself watching his hands when he wasn't looking, large, scarred, in places, very sure of themselves. "What time do you start in the morning?" she asked. 4:30, usually. "I can be up by 5, if there's anything useful I can do." He looked at her. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." He seemed to consider that. "The chickens," he said. "If you're up, they need feeding by 6, and the eggs." "All right," he nodded. That was apparently settled. She slept that night under his mother's quilt and listened to the house breathe around her, the tick of the baseboard heaters, the wind outside pressing against the east wall, the distant sound of cattle somewhere in the dark, and she thought, "I have done a very strange thing." And then, more quietly, "I hope I have not done the wrong thing." She was not sure, yet, whether those were different thoughts. The first weeks passed in the particular way that unfamiliar things become familiar. Not all at once, but in small accumulations. She learned where he kept the extra feed. She learned that he drank his coffee black and made it strong, and that there was always a pot ready, by 4 in the morning, because he was always already up. She learned that he was not naturally talkative, but that he was not unkind, that when he said something, it was worth hearing, and that his silences were not a closed door, but simply a room he lived in. She started leaving a second cup beside the pot. He never mentioned it. But the second morning she did it. She came into the kitchen to find a small jar of the good jam from town sitting next to the toaster. She hadn't mentioned she liked jam. She had only spread some on her toast the previous morning while he was outside. She mentioned this to her mother on the phone that evening, out on the porch so he wouldn't hear, and Adele was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, he's watching." Celia looked out at the fields. "I know. Is that a bad thing?" She thought about it. "I don't think so." She was starting to see the shape of who he was under the surface of him that showed the world. He was the kind of man who fixed things before they broke, who drove an extra 40 minutes to the better veterinary clinic when one of the herd was off, who kept his word without being asked twice. He was not easy, as her father had said. He was solitary and set in his ways, and he did not explain himself often. But there was an integrity to him that she found unexpectedly that she trusted. He was also, she noticed in the particular noticing, without meaning to way of someone living in close quarters with another person, not bad to look at. She kept that observation to herself. It was mid-April when the trouble arrived. She had been walking the fence line on the east side of the property. She had taken to doing a daily check with the dog. a three-legged border collie named Biscuit, who had adopted her with the cheerful indiscrimination of a dog who had been slightly lonely, when she saw the truck parked at the end of the road that ran along the property boundary. It was white, unmarked, and it was there again the following morning. She mentioned it to Renaud at dinner. He set his fork down. He did that thing he did sometimes where he was very still for a moment, like he was running through information internally before he responded. "What time?" he said. "Both times, around 9 in the morning." "Which side?" "The east fence. Near the Hollis Creek crossing." He was quiet again. Then, "I'll take a look." She wanted to ask him what he thought it was. She could see from his expression that he had a thought about it that he wasn't sharing yet, and the fact that he wasn't sharing it made the back of her neck feel tight. She had the particular sensitivity of a woman who had spent her adult life reading the temperature of a room, and the temperature of this one had changed. She found out 3 days later, not from him, but from her father. Walter called on a Thursday morning, when Renaud was out with the cattle operation, and what he told her made her stand very still in the kitchen, with the phone pressed against her ear for a long time after he'd finished. There was a man named Douglas Crane. He was a property developer out of Calgary, and he had been making offers on farmland in the Dunmore area for the past 2 years. Not aggressive offers, not threatening ones, but persistent ones. He had bought out 4 operations already, families who'd been struggling, and what he did with the land afterward was consolidate it and sell it at a significant markup to a larger corporation that was in the business of industrial grain operations. The farms disappeared. The family scattered. He wanted the Thibodeau land. He had apparently made an offer to Renaud twice in the past year, and Renaud had said no both times. What Walter had heard from someone at the feed store, the way everything eventually came around through the feed store, was that Crane was no longer in the mood to take no for an answer. There were whispers about a disputed boundary survey, about water rights along the creek, about legal mechanisms that could tie up a single-owner operation long enough to make financial continuation impossible. Celia put down the phone and stood in the kitchen for a while. Then she put on her boots and went to find her husband. She located him at the equipment shed, working on the hydraulic line of the baler. He was lying half under the machine, with his feet sticking out. She waited. After a moment he slid out, looked up at her from the ground, because he sat up without her having to say anything. Her. "Crane," she said. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Your father called. Why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. "It started before you got here. Felt like my problem to manage." "Renaud." She looked at him steadily. "I'm your wife." He met her eyes. Something shifted in his face. Not much, just a slight loosening, like a fist unclenching. "I know," he said. "So tell me." He did. The white truck she had seen was almost certainly someone Crane had hired to document the property, looking for anything that could support a challenge to the existing boundary survey, which Crane's lawyer had apparently suggested was inaccurate. The creek had historically been used as a reference point for the eastern property line, and over the years creeks moved. There was a chance, if Crane pushed it, that he could argue for a survey reassessment that would shave off a significant portion of the most productive eastern pasture. The legal fees alone, if it went to court, would be severe. "He's betting I can't sustain a fight," Renaud said. "Can you?" He was honest with her, which she had come to understand was the only way he was. Not for long. She sat down on an upturned crate and thought. She had spent 2 years at the Agricultural Supply Company, and before that a year bookkeeping for a small operation near Tabor. She understood the particular economics of farm debt in ways that people who hadn't grown up around it often didn't. She also knew something about land records, because her father had once had a boundary dispute of his own, a smaller one, that had been resolved with documentation. "Do you have the original survey on this property?" she said. "Somewhere in the house. From when my grandfather filed the quarter section, and the creek. Is there anything else that documents the line? Old photographs, old correspondence." He looked at her differently then. Not like she was someone he was assessing, the way he had in those first weeks, but like she was someone he was actually seeing. "My father kept records, boxes of them. In the back room." "Show me." They spent that evening and the following 3 evenings going through his father's boxes. The particular archaeology of a farm family's administrative life, held together by rubber bands and old folders, and the occasional envelope that had never been properly sorted. Renaud made coffee and she organized, and he told her what things were when she held them up, and gradually a picture assembled itself. His grandfather had been a precise man. There were photographs dated of the creek crossing from the 1960s and again in the 70s. There was correspondence with the county about drainage rights. There was a letter from a neighbor, now long gone, that referenced the eastern fence line by description. None of it was individually conclusive, but taken together it built a record of the boundary that predated any recent creek movement and pointed to the original survey as accurate. "This is good," Celia said, late on the third night, spreading the relevant documents out on the kitchen table. "A lawyer who knows land records will know what to do with this." Renaud was standing across the table from her, looking at the papers, but she had the sense he was looking at her. "You know what you're doing," he said. "I worked in agricultural supply for 2 years. You learn things." "That's not what I mean." She looked up. He was watching her with that careful stillness she had come to know, but there was something warm in it now that hadn't been there before, or maybe it had always been there and she had only now learned to read it. "I mean," he said, "that you jumped in when you found out. You didn't pull back." She looked down at the papers. "Did you think I would?" He didn't answer that directly, which was his way. "I didn't know," he said. "I don't know you that well yet. You know me better than you did." "Yes." A pause. "I do." She stacked the documents carefully and reached for the envelope she'd set aside for the most important ones. Her hands were slightly unsteady, and she wasn't entirely sure why. "We should get these to a lawyer in the morning. Celia." She stopped. He almost never used her first name. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. It was the simplest thing. But the way he said it made her feel something shift in her chest. The same thing that had shifted loose in the parking lot in Dunmore and that she had been trying not to examine since. She shotted and said, "Get some sleep." Early morning, and he said, "Yeah," and she went down the hall to her room and sat on the edge of the bed under his mother's quilt for a long time before she lay down. Outside, the spring wind was different from the winter one. Softer, carrying something new in it. The lawyer was a woman in medicine hat named Sinclair, brisk and efficient, who looked at Renaud's grandfather's records and said they were better than she had expected. She advised him on the specifics of a preemptive boundary declaration, which would essentially get the county on record with the existing survey before Crane could move to challenge it. It would cost money. Not a ruinous amount, but real money. And it would need to be done quickly, before Crane filed anything. Renaud said yes, do it, he told Celia that evening. She nodded and said that was the right call, and had said, "I know. I just thought you should hear it." She looked at him for a moment and then said, "Thank you for telling me." Things had changed between that sentence and this one. She couldn't have said exactly when, but they had. She had started eating dinner across from him, not out of necessity, but because she wanted to. She had started noticing when he came in from outside in the evenings, not to see whether he needed anything, but simply because she noticed. He had started doing the same. She became aware of it gradually, the way his attention tracked her, not obtrusively but steadily, the way you keep track of the weather when you're working outside. On a Thursday evening in late April, she was at the counter chopping vegetables for a stew, and he came in from the field and hung up his jacket, and for a moment he stood at the entrance to the kitchen, just watching her. She felt it without seeing it. "Problem?" she said without turning around. "No. You're just standing there. I know." She put down the knife and turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and an expression she had not seen on him before. Not exactly. It was something careful and questioning and open, and coming from a face that was usually so reserved, it was striking. "Renaud," she said. "I don't know how to do this part," he said. "I should tell you that up front." "What part?" He looked at her steadily. "The part where I tell you this arrangement has stopped feeling like one." She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she said, "To me either." He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment. That same look, careful and questioning, and then he reached out and put his hand against her face, very gently, the same way he handled things he was uncertain of. She put her hand over his. He exhaled slowly, like something that had been held too long was releasing. He kissed her, not like in Dunmore, not the brief press to the cheek, slowly, with intention. She put a hand on his chest and felt his heart under her palm. The stew didn't get made until much later. She didn't mind. Douglas Crane's challenge did not die quietly. His lawyer filed a preliminary query with the county land office in early May, and for 3 weeks, Celia and Renaud lived in the particular tension of waiting, the kind of tension that would have been intolerable on its own, but that was made somehow bearable by the fact of them. She made coffee, and he drank it. He fixed fence in the mornings, and she did the books in the afternoons, and sometimes she brought him lunch at the field, and they ate together, sitting on the tailgate of the truck in the cold spring sunshine, without feeling any need to fill every moment with words. Her father drove out one Sunday. He walked the property with Renaud, and she watched them from the kitchen window. The older man and the younger one, talking in the easy way men sometimes talk when they are walking, and don't have to look at each other. Walter had brought his tools without being asked. He spent an hour helping Renaud with the south gate. When they came in for coffee, Walter looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him in years, a complicated look, a father's look, and she understood that he was assessing something. Later, on his way out, he stopped beside her and said quietly, "Are you all right?" She thought about the word arrangement. She thought about the drive to Dunmore in March, and the parking lot, and the quilt on the bed. She thought about a man crossing a kitchen with something careful and questioning in his face. "Yes," she said, and meant it simply, without reservation, for the first time in a long time. Sinclair called on a Wednesday morning. The county had accepted the boundary declaration. Crane's lawyer had received formal notice that any subsequent challenge would face a documented historical record dating back 60 years, which made the basis for dispute substantially weaker. Crane could still pursue it, but the cost-benefit calculation had shifted. He dropped it. Renaud was outside when the call came. She waited until he came in for lunch and told him. He stood at the sink for a moment with the water running, looking out the window at the back fields. Then he turned off the tap and looked at her. "That's it then," he said. "That's it." He was quiet. She watched him absorb it, not with celebration, not with relief exactly, but with the settled expression of a man who had been waiting for the ground to hold and had now felt it hold. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she rested her forehead against his shoulder and felt his chin come down on the top of her head. "We're all right," she said. "We're all right," he agreed. Outside, the field stretched east to the property line, the real one, the one documented in 60 years of records and letters and photographs, and one woman's grandfather's careful handwriting. The creek ran along the boundary where it had always run. The cattle grazed in the south pasture. Biscuit, the three-legged border collie, was doing something in the yard that probably involved a ground squirrel. The spring was settling in properly now. The sky was high and clear, and the particular shade of blue it only gets on the prairies, where there's enough sky to really see it. It was not the life she had planned. It was not the story she would have written for herself at 26, if someone had handed her the pen and told her to go ahead. But there was something to be said for the stories you didn't write, for the ones that happened to you instead, that caught you off guard and turned out to be more than you'd known to ask for. She thought that maybe that was its own kind of good fortune. She stayed where she was, her head on his shoulder, and let the morning happen around them.